Hey everyone, and welcome back to Know What You Believe, the podcast where we dive deep into theology and explore how it shapes our everyday lives. I'm Archer, and I'm so glad you're here for episode 5.
And I am Zoe.
If you've been following along, you know we've been building a foundation for understanding who God is. We started by asking, who is God? Exploring his holiness, goodness, and fatherhood. And now we're shifting our focus to what God does, starting with one of the biggest questions of all. Did God create everything? This question isn't just about origins, it's about meaning, purpose, and the very nature of existence. If God is the creator, what does that tell us about him? What does it tell us about ourselves? And how does recognizing him as creator change the way we see the world around us? In today's episode, we're going to explore the doctrine of creation, what it means to say that God created everything, both visible and invisible, through his sovereign will and divine power. We'll look at how creation reflects God's character, how it reveals his intent and purpose, and what it tells us about our place in his story.
Now, I know that when we talk about creation, a lot of different debates come to mind. Scientific theories, timelines, interpretations of Genesis. And while those are important discussions, today's episode isn't about arguing over the how of creation. Instead, we're going to focus on the why creation matters, why it points us to God, and why it shapes how we live. So whether you're listening on your commute, at the gym, or just sitting at home with a cup of coffee, I'm excited to dive into this with you.
All right, let's start by grounding ourselves in our definition. God created everything, visible and invisible, through his sovereign will and divine power. All creation reflects his goodness, beauty, majesty, and glory. Now, before we go any further, let's address something right up front. When people hear a question like, did God create everything? Their minds often jump straight to debates about creation theories, young Earth, old Earth, evolution, intelligent design. And while those discussions are important, that's not where we're going to focus today. Instead, we're going to talk about something bigger, something that unites all Christians, regardless of where they land on those debates. And that's this: God is the creator. That truth is absolutely foundational to our faith. Genesis 1:1 starts with it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. John 1:3 reaffirms it. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. And Colossians 1:16 expands on it. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible. Everything owes its existence to God. The universe, the stars, the oceans, the mountains, the microscopic details of life. And that means that all of creation in some way reveals something about who he is.
One of the most important things to understand here is that God reveals himself in two ways: through natural revelation and supernatural revelation. Natural revelation is what we see in creation itself: science, nature, reason, logic. Psalm 19 verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands." In other words, when we look at the universe, its vastness, its complexity, its beauty, it tells us something about the power, intelligence, and creativity of God. Have you ever stood at the edge of the ocean, staring out at the waves and felt small? Or looked up at the night sky filled with stars and felt overwhelmed? That's natural revelation at work. It reminds us that we are part of something bigger, that we were created by someone greater. This is why Paul says in Romans 1:20, "For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made."
Creation itself is constantly pointing us back to God. Scientists, artists, and thinkers across cultures and history have looked at the world and seen patterns, order, and design, clues that there's a creator behind it all. And the more we learn about the universe, the more it affirms this. Think about DNA, complexity of ecosystems, the precise fine-tuning of the universe that allows life to exist. These things don't happen by accident. They reflect an intentional, powerful, and intelligent creator. But here's the thing. While natural revelation can show us that God exists, it doesn't tell us who he is. It doesn't tell us about his love, his grace, or his desire for a relationship with us.
That's where supernatural revelation comes in. God didn't just create the world and leave us to figure things out. He spoke to us. He revealed himself through his word, the Bible, his covenants with his people, and ultimately through Jesus Christ. Hebrews 1 verse 1 and 2 puts it this way. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways, but in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. This means that if we want to understand creation fully, we need both types of revelation. Natural revelation shows us God's power and creativity, the vastness of the universe, the intricate details of life. Supernatural revelation tells us his purpose and plan, why he created us, what went wrong, and how he is making things right.
Now let's address something really important. Sometimes people think faith and science are in conflict. That's just not true. If we truly believe that God created everything, then we don't have to be afraid of scientific discovery. We don't have to ignore reason or logic. Instead, we should see science as a tool that helps us understand God's creation more deeply. For example, think about the laws of physics, the fact that gravity works, that energy is constant, that the universe operates under strict mathematical principles. That's not random. That's evidence of a God who is both a designer and a sustainer. Or think about beauty. Why do we find mountains, sunsets, and music beautiful? Why do we even have a concept of beauty at all? That's something science alone can't explain. Beauty isn't just functional, it's intentional. It's a gift from a creator who wants us to experience joy and awe. And this is the key takeaway. Creation isn't just evidence of God, it's an invitation to worship.
Revelation 4:11 says, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being." We don't worship creation itself, we worship the one who made it. When we see a breathtaking view, when we marvel at the complexity of life, when we experience the wonder of existence itself, our response should be the same as the psalmist in Psalm 95 verse 6. Come, let us bow down in worship. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker.
So to summarize, yes, God created everything. He reveals himself through both natural and supernatural revelation. Faith and science are not enemies, but partners in understanding his world. Creation isn't just a fact, it's an invitation to worship. Now that we've laid this foundation, let's take the next step. What does creation tell us about God's purpose and intent? Because creation isn't random. It's ordered, meaningful, and full of purpose. Let's explore that next. So now that we've established that God is the creator of everything, let's take a step deeper. If God created the universe, what does that tell us about his intent, his purpose, and his intentionality? Because creation isn't just a random act, it's deeply meaningful. Every part of it reflects order, beauty, and design. And when we start to see that, it changes the way we understand who God is and what he's doing in the world. One of the first things we see in the creation story is that God brings order out of chaos. Genesis 1:2 tells us that before creation was formed, the earth was formless and empty, darkness was over the surface of the deep. In the ancient world, the idea of chaotic waters represented disorder, uncertainty, something that needed to be tamed. But what does God do? He speaks and suddenly there is light, structure, and purpose. He separates the waters, forms dry land, creates boundaries, and establishes rhythms. Creation is an act of ordering, taking what is wild and unformed and giving it meaning. This theme runs all throughout Scripture. God is constantly bringing order out of chaos. When the Israelites are wandering in the wilderness, he gives them structure through the law and the tabernacle. When the world is broken by sin, he sets a plan of redemption in motion. And even in our own lives, God is always at work, bringing clarity where there was once confusion, peace where there was once disorder. The way he creates is the way he continues to work.
This is something that's echoed in both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and it's fascinating to look at how these two creation accounts work together. Genesis 1 gives us a broad, structured, poetic picture of creation. God speaks, and things come into existence in an ordered sequence. Light and darkness, sky and sea, land and plants, then the sun, moon, and stars, then animals, and finally, humans. It follows a rhythm, with God declaring at the end of each stage that what he made was good. Then Genesis 2 zooms in on humanity's creation, showing us a more intimate, personal view. God forming Adam from the dust, breathing life into him, planting a garden, and shaping Eve from Adam's side. Both of these accounts tell us something profound about God's creative intent. Genesis 1 shows us that God is powerful, sovereign, and deliberate in how he establishes the universe. Genesis 2 shows us that he is also personal, relational, and deeply involved in shaping human life. He doesn't just speak us into existence, he forms us, he breathes into us, he places us in a setting where we can flourish. Creation isn't mechanical, it's relational.
Another thing we see in the creation story is that God builds in patterns of rest and rhythm. On the seventh day, God rests, not because he's tired, but because he's setting a pattern for his creation. The way the world is structured isn't just about productivity and progress. It's about balance, about flourishing. We see this idea reinforced in Israel's practice of Sabbath. In the cycles of the land, even in the natural world where animals and ecosystems have seasons of activity and rest. When we fight against these rhythms, when we live in constant hurry, never slowing down, never making space for reflection and renewal, we are working against the grain of creation itself. And this leads us to an important truth. Creation was made with purpose. Every part of it is intentional. This is one of the biggest distinctions between the biblical creation account and the other creation stories that existed in the ancient world. In many ancient myths, the world was created out of conflict, gods battling each other, violence producing the earth as an accident or an afterthought. But in Genesis, creation isn't the result of war or chaos. It's the result of love, of deliberate intention. That means you are not an accident. Your life is not random. You are a part of a story that started before time began, and you were created with a purpose in mind. Psalm 139, 13-14 says, "For you created my inmost being. You knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made." God's creativity isn't just about the stars and the mountains. It's about you. You were crafted, formed, known. And if that's true, then the way we live matters. The way we steward creation matters. The way we participate in the order and beauty of the world around us matters. This is why Scripture talks about humans as co-creators with God. We were made in his image, given the task of cultivating, building, tending, and shaping the world. The very first command given to humanity is in Genesis 1:28. Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea, and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground.
That word subdue doesn't mean exploit or destroy. It means cultivate. Bring out the potential, help creation flourish. We are meant to reflect God's creative work in the way we live. That means using our gifts, whether in art, science, teaching, parenting, or anything else, to bring goodness into the world. It means caring for the earth, because the world isn't just a resource, it's part of God's creation, meant to reflect his glory. So when we look at creation, we're not just seeing raw material, we're seeing purpose. We're seeing the fingerprints of a God who shapes, orders, and sustains. And the more we recognize that, the more we're drawn into awe, wonder, and responsibility. So now that we've looked at God's intent and purpose in creation, let's go even further. What does creation tell us about God himself? How does the beauty, the majesty, and the intricacy of the world point us back to his character? That's what we'll explore next.
So we've talked about how creation isn't random, it's intentional, purposeful, and reflects God's order. But now let's take that one step further. What does creation reveal about who God is? Because if everything that exists was made by him and for him, then woven into creation itself are clues about his goodness, beauty, majesty, and glory. One of the most breathtaking things about creation is that it isn't just functional, it's beautiful. God didn't just create a world that works, he created a world that moves us. He could have made food that simply gave us nutrients, but instead, he gave us flavors, spices, and variety. He could have made a sky that was always the same color, but instead he paints it differently every morning and every evening. He could have made a universe that was just practical, but instead he filled it with things that make us stand in awe. Towering mountains, vast oceans, distant galaxies. And that tells us something really important. God values beauty. Beauty isn't just an extra feature of the universe, it's at the heart of who God is. In Genesis 1, after each act of creation, God steps back, looks at what he made, and declares, "It is good." And that word, good, doesn't just mean morally right. In Hebrew, the word used is tov, which also carries the meaning of pleasing, beautiful, and full of purpose. That means creation doesn't just reflect God's power, it reflects his joy. God delights in what he has made, and because we are made in his image, we are wired to delight in it too. That's why we feel something when we stand in front of a breathtaking view or hear a piece of music that stirs our soul. That's why nature has a way of drawing people towards something bigger than themselves. The beauty of creation is a direct invitation to worship the Creator.
Psalm 19 verse 1 puts it like this: "The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands." The very existence of beauty points us to a God who is glorious beyond comprehension. And this leads us to something else: majesty. When we look at creation, we are confronted with a reality that is so much bigger than us. The size of the universe alone is overwhelming. Scientists estimate that there are about 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. Think about that. Trillions of galaxies, each containing billions of stars, stretching across a vastness we can't even comprehend. And yet, Isaiah 40:26 says, "Lift up your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all these? He who brings out the starry host one by one and calls forth each of them by name." God names the stars. He isn't just powerful enough to create the universe, he is intimately aware of every single detail within it.
And that's where we see the mystery of God's glory. His majesty isn't just about his size or power, it's about the fact that he holds both the vastness of the cosmos and the smallest details of life in his hands. He is both transcendent, above and beyond all things, and immanent, deeply present within his creation. We see this even more clearly when we compare Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Genesis 1 presents a big picture, cosmic view of creation. God speaks and galaxies are formed. Genesis 2 zooms in and shows us an up-close, intimate picture of God forming humanity, breathing life into Adam, planting a garden with his own hands. The same God who created the stars also stooped down to shape the first human from the dust. That's glory. That's majesty. That's personal love.
Creation also reveals God's generosity. He didn't just create a world for survival, he created a world overflowing with abundance. Think about it. When God provides for his people, he doesn't do it sparingly. In the wilderness, he doesn't just give enough manna to survive, he provides daily, faithfully. When Jesus turns water into wine, he doesn't just make a little, he makes 150 gallons of the finest wine. When he multiplies the loaves and fish, there are baskets of leftovers. God's generosity is written into the fabric of creation itself. Every tree that bears fruit, every river that brings life, every breath we take, it all points to a creator who is not stingy but overflowing with goodness. James 1:17 says, "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights."
And here's what's really incredible. God didn't just make a world full of beauty and wonder. He invites us to participate in it. He gives us the ability to create, to make art, to cultivate land, to build, to explore. That's because we are made in his image. Our creativity is an extension of his. The joy we feel when we make something, whether it's a song, a painting, a home-cooked meal, or a well-crafted sentence, is a reflection of the joy God felt when he made the world. But here's where we have to pause. If creation is so full of beauty, goodness, and glory, why does it sometimes feel so broken? Why do we see suffering, destruction, and decay? If everything was made good, why does the world often feel not good? This is where we have to understand that while creation reveals God's goodness, it also groans for redemption. Romans 8:22 says, "We know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbirth right up to the present time." Sin didn't just affect human hearts, it affected creation itself. The world that was designed to reflect God's glory was subjected to frustration, decay, and brokenness. We see it in natural disasters, in disease, in the ways creation itself seems to be longing for restoration. But here's the good news. The story doesn't end there.
Just as God created the world in the beginning, he promises to recreate it in the end. Revelation 21:5 says, "Behold, I am making all things new." The same God who spoke the universe into existence will one day restore everything to its rightful beauty. And that leads us to the most important question. Where do we fit into all of this? If creation reveals God's power, goodness, and majesty, then what does it reveal about us? Our role, our purpose, our place in God's story? That's what we'll explore next.
So far, we've seen that creation isn't just something God did, it's something that reveals who he is, his power, his beauty, his majesty, his generosity. It's all woven into the world he made. But now we need to ask another big question. What does creation reveal about us? If God designed the universe with intent and purpose, what does that mean for our place in it? This is where we come to one of the most profound ideas in Scripture. We were made in the image of God. Genesis 1:26 through 27 tells us, "Then God said, 'Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground.' So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female, he created them." This is huge. Out of everything God made, the stars, the oceans, the mountains, only humans are said to bear his image, and that means we are fundamentally different from everything else in creation. We are not just advanced animals, not just an accident of biology. We are created to reflect God himself.
So, what does that actually mean? First, it means we were created for relationship. If you go back to Genesis 1, you'll notice something interesting. Every time God creates something, he speaks it into existence. Let there be light. Let the land produce vegetation. But when he creates humans, the language changes. God doesn't just speak us into being, he forms us. In Genesis 2:7 it says, "Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and the man became a living being." This is personal. It's intimate. The creator of the universe breathes life into humanity. And that tells us that from the very beginning, we were designed for relationship with him. We weren't just made to exist, we were made to know Him.
In the ancient world, the idea of being made in a god's image was usually reserved for kings. A king was thought to be the image of a god, meaning he ruled on the god's behalf. But in Genesis, this idea isn't limited to a king. It's applied to every human being. Male and female, rich and poor, every person is created as a royal representative of God, meant to reflect His rule, His justice, and His character in the world. That leads us to another key truth. Being made in God's image means we were created for responsibility. Right after God creates humans, He gives them a role. Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground. Genesis 1:28. Now, when we hear the word rule, it might sound harsh, like we're supposed to dominate creation. But in Hebrew, the idea here isn't exploitation, it's stewardship. To rule as God's image bearers means to care for creation the way He would. It means cultivating, protecting, and bringing flourishing to the world, not exploiting it for selfish gain.
This is another place where Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 work together beautifully. Genesis 1 gives us the big picture view. Humanity is called to fill the earth and rule over it. Genesis 2 zooms in and gives us a garden, a specific place where Adam is put to work and keep the land. Genesis 2:15. The Hebrew words here, abad, meaning work, and shamar, meaning keep, imply both cultivation and care. In other words, humans are meant to partner with God in bringing order, beauty, and life into the world. This is where we get the idea of co-creation, that part of what it means to be made in God's image is that we, too, are creators. Not in the sense that we make things out of nothing like God does, but in the sense that we take what He has given and shape it into something more. We plant gardens, build cities, write music, design technology, create art. All of it is an extension of the creative mandate God gave us in Genesis. But here's where we need to talk about what went wrong. Because if humans were created to reflect God's goodness, if we were designed to rule with justice and love, then why do we see so much brokenness in the world?
Genesis 3 gives us the answer. Humanity's first sin wasn't just about eating a forbidden fruit. It was about rejecting God's authority. Instead of ruling with God, Adam and Eve wanted to rule apart from Him. They wanted to define good and evil on their own terms. And the result? Brokenness. The image of God in humanity wasn't erased, but it was distorted. Instead of ruling with justice, we exploit. Instead of stewarding creation, we abuse it. Instead of reflecting God's love, we often reflect selfishness, greed, and pride. And the consequences of that first rebellion have been rippling through human history ever since. But here's the hope. God's plan has always been to restore what was lost.
This is where Jesus comes in. Colossians 1:15 says, "The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation." In other words, Jesus is the perfect image bearer. He shows us exactly what humanity was meant to be, and through Him, we are being remade. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, "And we all, who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory, are being transformed into His image with ever-increasing glory." That's the story of redemption. Jesus restores what sin distorted. He not only saves us from our brokenness, but He also restores us to our original purpose, to reflect God, to rule with love, to bring order and goodness into the world.
So when we look at creation, we're not just seeing God's power, we're seeing our own purpose. We were made to be a part of something bigger, to live in relationship with God, to steward His world, to reflect His character. And that leads us to our final section. How do we actually live this out? If creation tells us something about God and it tells us something about us, then how do we respond? How do we let this truth shape our daily lives? That's what we'll talk about next. Alright, so we've covered a lot today. We've seen that creation isn't just something that happened, it's something that reveals who God is. what he values, and what he desires for us. We've talked about how everything in creation points to God's power, beauty, and intentionality. And we've explored what it means to be made in his image, to be created for relationship, purpose, and stewardship. But now we need to ask the big question. What do we do with this? How does this change the way we live? Because theology is never just about knowledge. It's about transformation. So let's get practical.
First, let's talk about loving God. If creation was made to reflect God's glory, then our natural response should be worship. That means slowing down and actually seeing the world around us as a reflection of his beauty. When was the last time you looked at the stars and let it remind you of God's majesty? When was the last time you stood in awe of a sunrise, a mountain range, or even the intricate details of a single flower? Psalm 19 verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." Creation is constantly pointing us toward him, but we have to be willing to look. So this week, I want to challenge you. Take a moment to pause. Step outside. Notice the beauty around you. And instead of just admiring it, let it lead you to worship.
Now let's talk about loving others. If we believe that every human being is created in God's image, then that should change the way we treat people. Every person, no matter their background, their struggles, or even their mistakes, has inherent dignity and worth because they bear God's image. That means we don't get to pick and choose who we see as valuable. The person you disagree with, made in God's image. The person you struggle to forgive, made in God's image. The person society overlooks, made in God's image. So here's my challenge. This week, ask God to help you see someone through his eyes. Maybe it's a coworker, a family member, or even a stranger. Instead of just reacting to them, take a step back and remind yourself, this person reflects God, even if imperfectly, and let that truth shape the way you interact with them.
First, let's talk about loving God. If creation was made to reflect God's glory, then our natural response should be worship. That means slowing down and actually seeing the world around us as a reflection of his beauty. When was the last time you looked at the stars and let it remind you of God's majesty? When was the last time you stood in awe of a sunrise, a mountain range, or even the intricate details of a single flower? Psalm 19 verse 1 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands." Creation is constantly pointing us toward him, but we have to be willing to look. So this week, I want to challenge you. Take a moment to pause. Step outside. Notice the beauty around you. And instead of just admiring it, let it lead you to worship.
Now let's talk about growth. What's next? If we are made in God's image, then we are called to reflect him in the way we live. That means growing into the people he created us to be. So what's one step you can take this week to better reflect God's image? Maybe it's using your creativity in a way that honors him. Maybe it's stepping into leadership with humility and wisdom. Maybe it's simply taking time to rest and trust that he is in control. Whatever it is, don't just let this be an abstract idea. Ask yourself, what is next? What's one area of your life where God is calling you to grow, to create, to cultivate goodness? And then take a step in that direction.
And finally, let's talk about who is next. If everything in creation was made to point back to God, then part of our role as image bearers is to help others see him. That means we don't just keep this truth to ourselves, we invite others into it. So who in your life needs to know that they are loved, created with purpose, and valued by God? Who needs to hear that their worth isn't based on their mistakes or their achievements, but on the fact that they are made in the image of their Creator? Maybe it's someone who has never set foot in church. Maybe it's someone who has been burned by religion. Maybe it's someone who just feels lost right now. This week, ask God, who is next? Who is he calling you to reach out to, encourage, or invite into a conversation about faith? It doesn't have to be complicated. It can be as simple as sharing what you've learned today or inviting them to listen to this podcast. But don't miss the opportunity.
So as we wrap up, let's remember this. Creation isn't just about the past, It's about the present and the future. It tells us who God is, who we are, and what we were made for. It calls us to worship, to love, to grow, and to invite others into the story. Thanks for joining us today on Know What You Believe. Next week, we're diving into a tough but crucial question. Why did God create us? Why did He make humans? It's a conversation that will challenge us, but also point us to the incredible hope we have in Jesus. Until then, keep loving God, loving others, and living out His kingdom. See you next time.